I don't know if you've been following Brian Shaw's training at the minute, but Joe Ken implements like a lot of these, what he calls readiness warm-ups, the ability to create reactive training methods, where you can create that kind of bubble, as it were, to control all life stresses around training. Okay guys, so welcome back to another episode. Today I'm not going to go through a Q&A, something slightly different. I put out a feeler last week, I think it was, about which topic people would be more interested in me going through, autoregulation or pain management, particularly around injury. And by quite a big landslide, the autoregulation came out on top. So next Q&A is going to be next week, but today we're going to go through autoregulation, okay? Now the goal of today's video is to take away direct practical points that you can implement more or less straight away with either your clients or your own training. There's going to be a little bit of theory, but it's primarily going to be centered around actual implementation and how we can, directly feed into training programs, okay? So the first thing we need to go through is obviously defining what autoregulation is. Now, it's something you may have heard been thrown around in, like, particularly the powerlifting world, in a lot of the strength community, but training programs in general. And all it is, to keep it really simple, is it's the ability to adjust stimulus that's provided by a training program based on an athlete's preparedness. So how you feel when you go into a training session, and what you can do to actually continue to keep the balance between fitness and fatigue in the position that you want it to be in. And to keep it really simple, okay, different training programs have either what's known as a proactive or a reactive methodology. Now, if you're interested in powerlifting or programming in general, you might have come across a company specifically called Reactive Training Systems. It's owned by a guy called Mike Toucher, who is very influential in the whole strength training world, and he's actually known for being kind of one of the thought leaders for the ability to create reactive training methods. And this is essentially where you can continue to direct adaptation, and you can adjust an athlete's training around external life stresses, okay? When you look at traditional periodization like concepts and templates, and a lot of, as we'd call them, cookie cutter programs, even though they do actually work for a lot of people, they are what's called proactive. So that is where everything is laid out ahead of time. You have to adjust your life around training, and that is the easiest way to define the difference between the two, okay? You can either have life around training or training around life. And for 90% of the population that are watching this, they're going to fall into the latter category. They're going to fall into a scenario where training isn't the number one priority, and nor should it be necessarily. It's something that's either got to be additive to what you normally do day to day, or something that just supplements a current healthy lifestyle. So even if strength is your absolute priority, you might not find yourself in a scenario where you can create that kind of bubble, as it were, to control all life stresses around training, in which case autoregulation becomes a very important factor that you have to understand. Now, even if you're not a coach watching this and you're just an athlete, I honestly think it's so important that it should be considered one of the kind of the principal laws of just training in general. I think everyone that gets into lifting should understand, at least on some kind of superficial level, what autoregulation is, because it will directly give you control of your training. And we know nowadays, even though we've got this digital world and you can communicate with your coach on hand, not everyone has access to being able to immediately adjust your training protocol. So sometimes being able to take a little bit of initiative is key, and we know that initiative in anything requires that education. The first thing that we want to clarify is autoregulation isn't how you feel. It's a massive misconception, particularly with the whole RPE methodology, which, let's face it, RPE there's nothing special about it. It is literally just a subjective assessment. It's been shown to be fairly accurate, but that's only really within well-trained individuals, so people that already have that range of experience. If you're relatively new to RPE as a construct, or relatively new to training in general, then it's not going to be the most accurate thing for you. So it's not always going off how you feel. There is an element of that, but the majority of the time it's more based on your performance and how that's going to dictate your training session that's coming up. And the reason I kind of want to bring awareness to that is there's this massive confusion where people almost rely too heavily on feeling good. And we won't go off onto like this tangential point about, the philosophy of training or anything, but to be brutally honest with you, training is meant to be difficult. It's not meant to be this smooth sailing, like, oh, I'm happy all the time, weights feel great, everything feels light, and oh, the numbers just keep climbing up. Like, I don't know why it's become this kind of avoidance mentality, but there's going to be an element of you having to graft. There's going to be an element of fatigue. There's going to be an element of feeling a little bit rough, getting niggles every now and again, and that's just part and parcel of the process of getting strong. Someone gets a little bit of knee pain from squatting and then the world's falling apart. So the key thing there is to not rely on this notion of everything feeling a little bit heavy as the key driving factor to auto-regulate a program, okay? Now, the problem with feelings being the key kind of driving factor behind auto-regulation is if you're chasing an outcome or a skill rather than an adaptation, which is something we'll touch on in a moment, then your own psychology gets in the way. And like I said, if you're in that scenario where you want everything to feel light and it's not, in reality it should feel fairly heavy, then this is going to get in the way, and you can undo essentially the whole goal of a training cycle, or maybe not training cycle, the micro cycle, so the session to session kind of adjustment. But you can undo a lot of that work just by dropping the load when you didn't necessarily need to. And a lot of coaches that are watching this now will understand that yes, there is a time when fatigue is too high and we do need to back off a little bit, but there's also a time when you're just being a little bitch and you need to kind of toughen up and crack on and grind the session out. Okay, so now that we've created a little bit of clarity about what autoregulation is, we now need to go into when to autoregulate. When is it important and when is it useful primarily? Okay, so before you even think about implementing autoregulation, first thing you need to do is create a little bit of clarity about what the goal of that training session is, okay? Is it an adaptation-based goal or is it an outcome-based goal? So the outcome scenario, if you're a powerlifter, for example, you might be working up to an opener. That might be the priority for that training session, and it might be quite important because it's going to influence what you do for a peaking or a tapering strategy building into a competition. In that scenario, okay, the outcome is quite essential because it's going to have a direct knock-on effect to the rest of your training. In which case, you might auto-regulate by reducing the volume with a lot of your assistance work. You might reduce the number of reps that you do in your warm-up set or something like that, just so you can hit that number and control everything else around it. On the flip side, if your goal is to drive muscle mass to the upper body and you feel particularly fatigued, okay, you might do the opposite. You might drop the heaviest session or the heaviest exercise, in that day, and you might keep the volume in with a lot of the other exercises because that's obviously driving the adaptation that we want. So that's the first thing that you need to take care of, okay? Next thing is to look out for indicators of fatigue. So we need to understand whether or not fatigue is elevated, what system is it that is causing it to be elevated, and is it chronic or acute? Now, for the general fatigue markers, one of the main ones that we're going to look at is resting heart rate or heart rate variability. Okay, now there's a lot of research on this. Some people, it's fairly ambiguous. Some people like it as an indicator, other people don't. The key thing we're looking for here isn't necessarily accuracy, but reliability, okay? And that's the same across all of these indicators. It's not necessarily to say that heart rate variability is the key to understanding recovery. There's a lot of research to suggest that it isn't. But if you have a fairly consistent heart rate variability day to day, and then all of a sudden it changes completely, we know that your level of preparedness is different. Might be better, might be worse, but the point is something has changed. So with your resting heart rate, to give an example, if you usually sit around, 65 to 70 day to day, and then you wake up one morning, you're going about your normal daily business and you have, you can feel heart palpitations, you might have a little bit of anxiety because that is accompanied with it, and you check and your resting heart rate is around 90, then you know something's not necessarily right. Doesn't mean you're going to be weaker, doesn't mean there's going to be anything negative that happens. You just know to kind of have a little bit of a red flag and think, right, I need to keep on the lookout now for the training session later on because it might have an influence there. And it's very similar with heart rate variability, okay? It's a good metric to track over time as a general indicator of your fatigue. Not necessarily directly influential to each training session, but it will give you an idea of whether or not you're recovering day to day over the course of, a full training week. Another thing to check in on is mood state, okay? Now, again, in this scenario, as is always the case, it's down to the individual. If you're the type of person where it's not uncommon for you to go through the, 4 seasons of emotion in a typical working day, then if you find yourself a little bit moody, then it's probably nothing to worry about, okay? If, however, you're the type of person where, most of your friends would define you as someone that's fairly happy, easygoing, that type of thing, and all of a sudden you're moody as fuck and you don't want to spend time with anyone, then chances are fatigue might be a little bit elevated. Could be something completely different, but again, it's just another indicator to start to flag up this notion of you might need to auto-regulate a training session. And then another one for over on a kind of general level is sex drive, libido, and general desire for social interaction. But in general, it's the notion of wanting to socialize with other people. That is a pretty big indicator. There's a lot of research to show that is directly tied in with fatigue, and it's used on a lot of Dowler assessment forms for a lot of high-level athletes as well. So now, by no means is that an exhaustive list. They're just ones that you can implement straight away. It is not difficult to get your phone out, click a timer, check your heart rate over the course of 60 seconds, bang, you're good, and you can do that every single day if you wanted to. Blood pressure is another one, but most people don't have access to a blood pressure cuff. Mood state, anyone can assess that. Sex drive, anyone can assess that as well. Now, let's go into in-session fatigue markers. So this is things that you can do within a session straight away that will directly tell you whether or not to auto-regulate, and more importantly, how to auto-regulate. Again, as a reminder, autoregulation is just the ability to adjust a training stimulus based on your preparedness. So my favorite one personally is to have what's called an indicator load or an indicator lift, okay? This is essentially like a litmus test that allows you to objectively monitor how you feel on that day. Whether or not it's something that is just, you're not focusing on that particular session, you need to switch on, or whether it's actual physical preparedness. An indicator lift is something that you'll do a submaximal load that you can do every single time you do that particular lift, and it will tell you roughly how things are going to go for that session, okay? And you would be surprised at how accurate these things are. So my absolute favorite one, for example, is a max double overhand deadlift, okay? If I'm going for a particularly neurological based like training session, you know, and I know I want to push the load as a priority, my nervous system is the key. Grip strength is very, very closely linked to like neurological output. So I'll literally just keep adding weight and building up to the max, like top end strength of what my double overhand deadlift is. Now, the only time this would be fairly inaccurate is if you've trained grip the day before. So to give you an idea for me personally, my current kind of double overhand strength is probably, I don't know, 220, 240, something like that. That's kind of the current marker. So if I'm deadlifting and all of a sudden I fail a 280 double overhand deadlift, unless I might prolong my warm up a little bit, which is a strategy I'll talk about later on, but chances are my fatigue levels are going to be a little bit higher, so my maximal neural strength might be slightly reduced. Another example might be the speed of a, like, I don't know, a set load on a squat, 140 kilos it might be. What we tend to recommend is around a 60% marker if you're using a set load on a speed basis. Purely because when you get past 60%, that's when we start to go into like significant overload territory. So something around like a 60% mark might be a really valuable place to stick that indicator and check what the speed is day to day within a training session. It really isn't that difficult. You can either get your mate to eyeball it, which obviously isn't going to be that accurate. You can get an app, you can video it. Again, not 100% accurate, but the point is it's giving you a little bit of an indication. And you take these things with a pinch of salt, guys. Like I said before, if you're a little bit moody one day, that doesn't mean the world's going to, you know, end and you can't train. It just gives you this notion of building a little bit of intuitiveness around your training. Another brilliant one within a lot of the athletic circles is jump height, okay? Again, depends on how you're going to measure this, but jump height is a very valuable kind of metric to be able to assess roughly where you are. If one day you're not jumping as high as usual, chances are that output is a little bit lower. Another one you can use is like a bodyweight exercise on like an AMRAP basis, provided you're not going to go to absolute fatigue. So something as simple as, you know, like max pull-ups within one unbroken set. Again, provided it doesn't kill you off before the training session, it can be a fairly useful metric to tell you roughly how you're feeling for the rest of the session there. And then one final one is unrecognized pain. Now this is just a red flag in general, but if you turn up to a training session and all of a sudden something hurts that's never hurt before, chances are you're not in the scenario where you can say, fuck it, let's just dive in and 1 rep max whatever lift I want to push because I feel like it. Chances are your body's giving you a little bit of a warning sign to pump on the brakes, okay? So now that we've got a few of those indicators that we can kind of track, what we need to decide now is how we're going to auto-regulate. So what do we do in that scenario? First thing I would do, is prolong your warm-up. This isn't even technically an auto-regulation strategy, but this is just something to do to give you this idea that all is not lost, okay? I'm a big believer in sometimes people being a little bit too sensitive. I'll talk about this when I do the pain video, but like I said at the start of this one, sometimes letting your feelings and your emotions dictate your physiological output, it's a slippery slope, guys, okay? And like I said, I would rather you exhaust all options of being able to remove this, quote, fatigue or pseudo-fatigue, we would call it in this scenario, and put yourself in a state of readiness, if that's possible, rather than just diving in headfirst and saying, oh my God, I need to, you know, adjust the training session because I don't feel like it today, okay? Really simple example of this, a lot of top strength coaches, but any of you watching this, I don't know if you've been following Brian Shaw's training at the minute, but Joe Ken implements like a lot of these what he calls readiness warm-ups, and a lot of top level coaches will use warm-up not on the basis necessarily of priming the body, but priming you psychologically as well. So something like rest time manipulation, it can drive this oxidative stress, which can create hormonal adaptations on like an acute basis, which get you switched on, okay? That get you switched on. Now I know that's a very geeky explanation, but this is what I mean about sometimes if you get under the bar and things feel heavy, all is not lost, okay? You can prolong your warm-up, get your body temperature up. It's the type of thing that people usually skip, do you know what I mean? I do it myself, we're all victims of it, where you were supposed to do a few submaximal reps before you actually went into the training, but you didn't. You were in a bit of a rush, you did less mobility work because you just thought you'd dive in on the squat and things feel heavy all of a sudden. Warm-ups are about priming your body just as much as they are preventing injury, so make sure that you actually exhaust that option first. But let's say you have done that and nothing seems to be working, all hope is lost and we need to auto-regulate. Okay, now these are just general guidelines from speaking to a few different coaches, from a lot of the reading that I've done and my own kind of experience with working with athletes. They are interchangeable, so sometimes, you know, reductions in volume work better for one person than another, but this is what I've tended to see, okay? And I would actually be really interested to see if you guys have had any different experiences, and you can just leave them in the comments below. But the general fatigue markers, okay, so the things that we spoke about earlier with mood state, like dropping libido, that type of thing, they tend to respond a little bit better with reductions in volume, like overall training volume within either a training session or training week. Volume tends to be a bigger driver of fatigue, but I think there's a big difference in fatigue being too high, okay, and that being the thing that pulls your fitness down, or fatigue being the same and fitness coming down, okay? And what I mean by that is, to keep it really simple on like a systems level, neurological fatigue, I won't go into the discussion of whether or not that's even a thing, but the neurological fatigue tends to be something where the fitness or the preparedness is lower, in which case volume isn't necessarily the driving thing there, okay? Just think about it as two independent variables: fitness, fatigue. Fatigue does mask fitness, but if fatigue stays the same and your fitness drops for whatever reason, technically the outcome is very similar there. The overall preparedness is lower, but it's from two different strategies. I hope that makes sense. But either way, the general fatigue markers, they tend to respond a little bit better by reducing the volume. So if you're feeling a little shitty, drop the volume. The intensity doesn't have to drop. This is a big thing that people are afraid of. Load is one of the biggest drivers, and everyone goes, oh shit, I can't hit that weight one day. That's fine, but also the reps actually drive a lot more of that overall fatigue than you think. On the flip side, however, if you've got the latter scenario where we have the fatigue level stays the same and the fitness level has dropped, in which case it's created this kind of pseudo fatigue that I talked about, in that scenario, those acute in-session markers tend to flag up. So the things like the jump height, the grip strength, all those things, they tend to lower themselves down a little bit, in which case reducing the intensity tends to be the goal there, okay? So let's give a simple example for these two scenarios. Example A. You've got a powerlifter who's coming in, they need to hit a weight, like an opening weight, okay? The outcome there is what they have in mind, and the actual number is the most important thing. They found from a standpoint of fatigue, they're feeling pretty shitty, not necessarily in the best mood all the time, and their resting heart rate is slightly elevated. But when they do a squat and it moves at a certain speed, nothing's changed. It feels heavier, but the actual output is very similar. In that scenario, you wouldn't have to drop the intensity. You could still work up to the opener. You could still hit that weight. You might just want to drop the volume of your assistance work in that training session. Let's take a second example. You're a bodybuilder or you're a young athlete who wants to put on size. You're feeling great because you're motivated, you're grinding, you're working really, really hard, but you're feeling ill one day, but it doesn't matter because you're gonna crack on, you're gonna grind through anyway. And then you unrack a set of dumbbells, you go to perform a set of 8 that you would normally do, and by the second rep, everything feels like it ain't going nowhere. You know, you're just hitting a brick wall, and no matter how good you feel, in that scenario, the in-session fatigue marker says, nah, it's not happening today, okay? In that scenario, the adaptation is the main goal. The outcome doesn't matter necessarily too much, but the adaptation is the main goal. There's a slight decrease in fitness because that in-session marker has told us that. So what I would do in that scenario is get you to reduce the intensity, but you can keep the volume the same. So you can keep the reps and the sets the same, but rather than building up to a set of 40 kilo dumbbells, you could just drop it down to the 30s and just go through the motions in that scenario. Put the muscle through a little bit of tension, and you'll still be able to chase that same adaptation. So you've been able to figure out whether or not you're going to reduce the volume or intensity. Now what do we do? How much do we reduce things by? Now, if we're talking about the intensity scenario, again, these are just general recommendations. They're not hard and fast rules. If any of you guys have any input in terms of what you've found to be successful, then again, I'd love to have a chat about it. But what I've seen and what I've read about and that type of thing is that 10% intervals tend to be a good margin, okay? Really simple example of this is a 60% max, or like a 60% 1 rep max lift doesn't necessarily look too different to a 65%, okay? But it does look very, very different to a 70% for most people. Same, 70 to 75, meh, not that much of a difference. 70 to 80, again, it looks quite different. This is the reason why, it's not just through ease of numbers, it's the reason why most people tend to band those intensity ranges together when you look at a lot of the literature. If, however, we're talking about volume, 10% reductions aren't that big, okay? They're not that noticeable. So in that scenario, I tend to recommend anywhere between 20 and 30% reductions. That sounds like a big drop, but remember, it's one training session, guys. You shouldn't necessarily have equal distribution of volume throughout the whole for your training week anyway. It should undulate up and down. You should have at least one light session in there at some point. When I mean light, I don't mean the number on the bar, I mean the overall volume and the general amount of work. So dropping that by 20 to 30% can be invaluable in terms of reducing those fatigue levels and, again, allowing you to auto-regulate and still chase the goal that you're after. And then one final thing to talk about is, obviously, if we're chasing the adaptation, so we're chasing a particular variable we're trying to improve upon, what other things can we do? How can we adjust it rather than just talking about numbers? And in this scenario, that's when we're going to talk about something that I like to call mechanical demand. Now, it's just a way of categorizing the stress that is placed on the body through exercise, okay? So in this scenario, you've got things like range of motion, exercise complexity, the stability of the movement, those types of things. It's basically how can you make an exercise more difficult and provide more stress to the system. That is one of these factors. And if you just take a second and really think about it, and if you're unsure, ask someone who you think, you know, has a decent bit of knowledge. But when you think about it, certain factors will lend themselves to different variables you're trying to improve upon. So maximum strength, we know that in that scenario, weight is the priority, okay? That's just well known. Then you've got kind of range of motion. That's another variable that's very important. So in those scenarios, if we're looking to drive the maximal strength adaptation, again, not interested in the number on the bar, not even interested in the exercise, I just want the body to become stronger. I want the muscles themselves to become stronger. In that scenario, you can reduce the range of motion, okay? So going from a deadlift to a block deadlift, for example, if the goal is to just chase neurological adaptation. Reducing the stability demand, again, going from a squat into a leg press, you can still drive that adaptation of overall like maximal strength without necessarily having that fatigue that the squat brings with it. Reducing the exercise complexity, okay? Going from a low bar squat to a high bar squat for some people might be much easier. And again, you can still drive strength to the lower body. And then reducing the overall fatigue in general, okay? So again, if you've got a set, let's say you've got 2 sets of 8 and you know that the 8 is the thing that's going to kill you, 8 sets of 2 is absolutely fine, okay? Again, you might want to drop the volume a little bit there, but that would be reducing the in-session fatigue to allow you to chase strength, okay? And just to give you a really simple, like as another example to see the contrast is, if however you're looking at driving strength endurance, let's say, so this is the durability of a muscle, you might want to reduce the weight that's lifted and keep the volume up, like I talked about earlier. You might want to reduce the spinal loading or the exercise complexity, or again, reduce the stability demand in mind. You don't necessarily want to do a full multi-phase movement that has lots of different variables to consider. You don't want to necessarily overload that when you're trying to drive strength endurance, but you could still drive endurance and still build that capacity within a much simpler movement, yeah? Really simple example might be going from a log press from floor to overhead to a barbell clean and press. The exercise complexity is a little bit lower, there's less stability demand, there's a little bit less spinal loading, and you can still drive that same adaptation. So guys, I hope that helps with a little bit of an in-depth kind of view on the auto-regulation side. If you've got any questions about your specific scenario, then please leave them in the comments below, because it's actually a very interesting topic, and it's more of an open kind of overview of what this concept is, rather than it being something that is a set guideline. But I do want to give you guys some kind of practical tips that you can take away. So I hope you took at least 1 or 2 gems out of that. If you do like the video, then please like the video. It's a huge help. And yeah, as always, if you've got any requests for specific videos or any questions that you want to be featured on the Q&A, then just leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. Okay guys, take care, stay strong, and I'll speak to you on the next one.